Before you try to change your life, pause and listen to the voice that speaks when no one else is around. That voice has been shaping your choices, your fears, and your sense of self long before you were aware of it. Most people believe their life is defined by circumstances, by other people, or by fate, yet the deepest influence comes from the quiet dialogue repeated every single day. What you tell yourself in moments of silence becomes the foundation of who you become. If that inner language is unconscious, life feels chaotic and reactive. If it becomes conscious, life begins to take shape with intention. This is not about positive thinking or empty motivation. It is about understanding the forces within you and learning to speak to them with honesty, responsibility, and awareness. Most people live as if every thought that passes through their mind is a fact, a command, or a reflection of who they truly are. From the moment you wake up, your mind begins producing commentary, judgments, memories, fears, and imagined futures, all flowing automatically. These thoughts feel intimate, so you assume they belong to you, but in reality many of them are inherited patterns shaped by childhood experiences, social conditioning, unprocessed emotions, and unconscious fears. When you identify with every thought, you allow these hidden forces to dictate your emotions and actions without question, turning your inner world into a place of quiet captivity. The mind is designed to generate thoughts constantly, just as the heart is designed to beat. It does not filter for truth or usefulness, it simply reacts. A single negative thought can trigger anxiety, shame, or anger if you believe it without awareness. Over time, repeated thoughts form mental habits, and these habits become beliefs. Beliefs then shape perception, making you see evidence that confirms what you already assume to be true. This is how a temporary thought slowly becomes a permanent identity. When someone tells themselves they are weak, unworthy, or incapable, the psyche organizes itself around that belief, reinforcing it through behavior and emotional responses. Recognizing that you are not your thoughts creates a vital psychological distance. This distance allows you to observe the mind rather than be consumed by it. Observation interrupts the automatic cycle of reaction. Instead of being pulled into fear or self-criticism, you begin to notice patterns, tones, and recurring narratives. Awareness does not silence the mind instantly, but it weakens the authority of destructive thoughts. The moment a thought is seen clearly, it loses its ability to control you completely. This separation is not an act of suppression or denial. Pushing thoughts away only forces them deeper into the unconscious, where they influence behavior indirectly. True observation involves allowing thoughts to arise without judgment while refusing to merge with them. In this space, emotional intensity begins to soften. You realize that a thought is an event, not an identity, a momentary expression of inner tension rather than a definition of self. Over time, this practice reshapes the psyche. You become less reactive and more intentional. Choices begin to emerge from consciousness rather than impulse. The inner world becomes less chaotic, not because thoughts disappear, but because they no longer rule uncontested. This awareness restores a sense of inner authority, where the self is no longer fragmented by every passing mental impulse, but grounded in clarity and self-recognition. Discomfort is often misunderstood as something that must be eliminated as quickly as possible, yet psychologically it serves a far deeper purpose. When discomfort arises, it signals an inner conflict, a misalignment between conscious behavior and unconscious truth. Most people are conditioned to escape this sensation through distraction, denial, or numbing habits, but avoidance does not dissolve discomfort. It only pushes it beneath awareness, where it gains intensity and influence. What is ignored in the inner world does not disappear. It waits and returns in more disruptive forms. Emotional discomfort frequently appears as anxiety, sadness, guilt, or restlessness. These feelings are not signs of weakness, but messages from the psyche. They point toward unresolved experiences, unmet needs, or suppressed parts of the self seeking acknowledgement. When you label discomfort as an enemy, you create an internal war. One part of you feels, while another part tries to silence it. This internal division drains energy and fragments the personality, leading to chronic tension and emotional confusion. Facing discomfort requires courage because it demands stillness and honesty. When you sit with uncomfortable feelings instead of escaping them, you begin to notice their texture and origin. Fear may reveal a boundary that has been crossed, sadness may point to ungrieved loss, and anger may expose a violation of personal values. Discomfort becomes informative rather than overwhelming when it is approached with curiosity instead of resistance. The psyche begins to release what it no longer needs to protect through pain. Avoidance reinforces fear. Each time discomfort is escaped, the unconscious learns that the feeling is dangerous, increasing sensitivity to it. This creates a cycle where even minor emotional signals trigger intense reactions. Confrontation breaks this cycle. By staying present with discomfort, you retrain the nervous system to tolerate emotional intensity without collapse. Over time, what once felt unbearable becomes manageable, and what was once feared loses its power. Growth does not occur in comfort, because comfort maintains existing structures. Psychological development requires the dismantling of outdated beliefs and defenses, a process that naturally produces discomfort. Resistance slows this transformation, while acceptance accelerates it. Acceptance does not mean liking pain or seeking suffering. It means allowing experience to exist without distortion. Through this process, discomfort transforms from an obstacle into a guide. It leads you toward integration, revealing where healing is required and where strength is waiting to be claimed. When you stop fighting discomfort, it no longer needs to shout, and the psyche begins to reorganize itself with greater balance, depth, and resilience. Human beings often assume that suffering is meaningless, something to be endured or escaped as quickly as possible, yet psychological struggle rarely appears without purpose. When life disrupts comfort, it exposes the fragile structures upon which identity has been built. Struggle strips away illusions of control and forces attention inward toward unresolved conflicts, neglected values, and unexamined beliefs. In this sense, hardship functions as a mirror, reflecting parts of the self that were previously hidden beneath routine and distraction. When pain is approached only as an enemy, it produces bitterness and helplessness. The mind searches for blame, asking why this is happening instead of asking what is being asked of it. Meaning does not arise from the absence of suffering, but from the interpretation of it. A challenge becomes psychologically destructive when it is experienced as random and purposeless. When meaning is found, the same pain becomes bearable, even transformative, because it is integrated into a larger narrative of growth and responsibility. Responsibility is central to meaning because it anchors suffering to action. Taking responsibility does not imply self-blame. It means recognizing one's capacity to respond consciously rather than react unconsciously. When a person accepts responsibility for their inner world, struggle becomes a call to develop strength, wisdom, and clarity. Without responsibility, suffering feels endless. With it, suffering becomes directional, pointing toward necessary change. Struggle often arises when old psychological patterns no longer serve the individual's development. The psyche resists change because familiarity feels safe, even when it is damaging. Meaning emerges when a person recognizes that discomfort signals the need for psychological evolution. This realization transforms chaos into a structured challenge rather than an overwhelming force. The individual begins to see pain not as a punishment, but as a demand for maturation. Avoiding struggle delays this process. When hardship is numbed or denied, the psyche compensates through anxiety, depression, or a sense of emptiness. These symptoms are not failures, but indications that meaning has not yet been integrated. The absence of meaning intensifies suffering because the mind cannot tolerate pain without context. Meaning provides a framework that allows endurance without despair. When struggle is accepted as part of the process of becoming whole, it reshapes identity. The individual no longer defines themselves by what happened to them, but by how they responded to it. This shift restores inner authority and dignity. Meaning does not remove pain, but it transforms it into a catalyst for depth, resilience, and psychological coherence. Many people spend their lives at war with parts of themselves they find unacceptable, uncomfortable, or frightening. These rejected aspects do not disappear simply because they are denied. Instead, they are pushed into the unconscious, forming a hidden inner territory that quietly influences behavior, emotions, and relationships. What is disliked or disowned within the self often resurfaces indirectly through sudden anger, irrational jealousy, projection onto others, or self-sabotage. The psyche seeks wholeness, and anything excluded from conscious awareness demands recognition in its own way. The parts you dislike about yourself usually developed as psychological responses to early experiences. Traits such as defensiveness, control, emotional numbness, or excessive sensitivity often began as survival mechanisms. At some point, they protected you from pain, rejection, or chaos. Over time, however, these same traits may become rigid and destructive. When you label them as purely bad and attempt to erase them, you overlook their original purpose and the energy stored within them. Rejection deepens fragmentation rather than healing it. Understanding these parts requires curiosity instead of condemnation. When you observe unwanted traits without judgment, you begin to see the fear, vulnerability, or unmet need beneath them. Aggression may conceal a wounded sense of power, withdrawal may hide deep sensitivity, and control may mask profound insecurity. By acknowledging these hidden motives, you reclaim psychological energy that was previously locked away. What was once expressed unconsciously can now be integrated consciously. Integration does not mean acting out destructive impulses or excusing harmful behavior. It means recognizing these inner forces, understanding their origin, and choosing how they are expressed. When awareness replaces repression, choice becomes possible. Strength emerges not from denying darker impulses, but from containing them with consciousness. This process creates inner balance, where no single part dominates or sabotages the whole personality. Hidden within rejected traits are often the very qualities needed for growth. Anger can transform into assertiveness, sensitivity into empathy, and fear into intuition. The same energy that once caused inner conflict becomes a source of creativity and resilience when integrated. This transformation requires honesty, patience, and the willingness to face uncomfortable truths about oneself without self-hatred. When individuals refuse to acknowledge their disowned aspects, these traits are projected onto others. People begin to despise in others what they cannot accept in themselves, creating conflict and misunderstanding. Integration reduces projection, allowing relationships to become clearer and more authentic. The inner world becomes less divided, and the personality gains depth and coherence. Wholeness is not achieved by becoming purely virtuous or flawless. It is achieved by embracing the full complexity of the human psyche. When rejected parts are brought into awareness, the individual no longer needs to fight themselves. Inner tension decreases, authenticity increases, and the psyche moves toward balance, strength, and psychological maturity. Comparison quietly erodes the sense of inner stability because it shifts attention away from one's own psychological path and toward an external measure that can never reflect inner reality. Each individual carries a unique combination of temperament, wounds, talents, and unconscious patterns shaped by experiences that no one else has lived. When you compare yourself to others, you flatten this complexity into a false standard, judging your inner process against someone else's visible outcomes. This creates a constant sense of inadequacy because the comparison is fundamentally unequal. The psyche develops through its own rhythm, not through competition. Growth is not linear, and it cannot be measured accurately from the outside. One person may appear confident while battling deep internal fragmentation, while another may seem uncertain while undergoing profound inner transformation. Comparison ignores these invisible dimensions and focuses only on surface achievements, reinforcing the illusion that worth is something to be proven rather than something to be integrated. When comparison becomes habitual, it strengthens the ego's dependence on external validation. Self-worth becomes conditional, rising and falling based on how one measures up in relation to others. This creates emotional instability and chronic dissatisfaction. No matter how much is achieved, there will always be someone who appears further ahead. The psyche remains restless because it is chasing an image rather than cultivating authenticity. Comparison also disrupts individuation, the process through which a person becomes psychologically distinct and whole. Instead of listening to inner signals, values, and intuitions, attention becomes oriented toward imitation. People begin pursuing goals that do not align with their deeper nature, leading to burnout, resentment, or emptiness. The more a person abandons their own path to follow another's, the more fragmented the inner world becomes. Letting go of comparison requires turning inward and accepting personal limitations alongside personal potential. This acceptance does not breed complacency. It creates clarity. When energy is no longer wasted on measuring oneself against others, it becomes available for genuine development. Progress is then evaluated against the only standard that matters, whether one is more conscious, responsible, and integrated than before. Comparison often masks unacknowledged insecurity. By constantly looking outward, the psyche avoids confronting unresolved self-doubt. When comparison is relinquished, these insecurities surface, offering an opportunity for honest self-examination. This confrontation is uncomfortable, but it is also liberating. Growth begins when attention returns to the inner world rather than remaining trapped in external rankings. A life guided by comparison remains reactive, shaped by what others do or possess. A life guided by inner development becomes intentional and meaningful. When the individual commits to becoming more whole rather than more impressive, the psyche stabilizes. Authentic confidence replaces envy, and the journey becomes defined by depth and self-recognition rather than endless measurement against others. Taking responsibility for the inner world is one of the most difficult yet transformative shifts a person can make. Many people believe responsibility applies only to external actions and circumstances, but psychological maturity begins when attention turns inward. Thoughts, emotional reactions, patterns of attachment, and habitual responses all shape lived experience. While external events may trigger inner reactions, they do not fully determine them. When responsibility is avoided, the inner world becomes ruled by past wounds, unconscious fears, and automatic defenses. Blame offers temporary relief because it removes the burden of self-examination. When suffering is attributed entirely to others or to fate, the individual feels justified but remains powerless. The psyche stays fixed in a reactive state, repeating the same patterns because nothing internal is questioned or changed. Responsibility, by contrast, restores agency. It does not deny past harm or injustice, but it recognizes that healing cannot occur while the inner world is governed by unresolved emotional residues. Accepting responsibility means observing emotional reactions without immediately acting on them. Anger, fear, or shame may arise, but instead of being expressed impulsively or suppressed, they are examined. This examination reveals underlying beliefs and unmet needs that drive behavior. Over time, this awareness weakens compulsive reactions and creates space for conscious choice. The individual begins responding rather than reacting. This process often meets resistance because it challenges long-held self-narratives. Seeing oneself as a victim can become an identity that provides meaning and protection from vulnerability. Letting go of this identity can feel like losing stability, even when it causes suffering. Responsibility demands humility, the willingness to admit unconscious participation in one's own patterns of pain. This admission is not self-condemnation. It is an act of honesty that opens the door to change. The inner world becomes more coherent as responsibility increases. Conflicting emotions are no longer split into opposing forces.